Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Yo, it's good New York. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI 99.5 FM. We're a socialist radio show and podcast for members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. NYC DSA is the biggest chapter of the largest socialist organization in the United States. We are run by our 5,500 plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. Today, we're discussing the end of the legislative session in Albany. Throughout the episode, we'll be speaking with State Senator Julia Salazar, an active member of the Democratic Socialists of America, about fighting for socialism, both as an organizer and an elected official. However, first we'll be hearing a report from the DSA-endorsed Tiffany Caban campaign on Election Day and how her victory can continue to build working-class power here in New York City. If you live in Queens, get out and vote. Later tonight at 9 p.m., we'll be covering this election results live here on WBAI. But first, the headlines brought to you by The Thorn.
This is Lee Zishi with the headlines from The Thorn. It's primary day, and last week, the New York Times weighed in on the Democratic primary for Queens District Attorney in favor of DSA-endorsed Tiffany Caban. The Queens DA race has even influenced the presidential race, with both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who endorsed Caban, being open to decriminalizing sex work, a major platform of Caban's campaign. And in Westchester, Lower Hudson DSA-endorsed public school teacher Kat Bresler is running for White Plains Common Council. The Democratic machine tried to keep Bresler off the ballot by challenging her signatures and using complicated election laws designed to make it difficult for primary challengers. Bresler is running on affordable and low-income housing. In Albany, at the end of the legislative session, the Green Light Bill, which grants driver's license to undocumented immigrants in New York, was finally passed and signed into law, over the objections of suburban Democrats. The law is a major victory for immigrant rights. A deal was also reached on the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act, which would make New York the 6th state to set a goal of 100% clean energy. At the last minute, Governor Cuomo swooped in and weakened environmental justice and labor standards. Listen to last week's episode of Revolutions Per Minute for more on the CLCPA. Working past the 2019 legislative session deadline, the state legislature killed bills that would ban solitary confinement and enact an automatic voter registration, infuriating advocates. However, Cuomo and the legislative leaders agreed to dramatically reduce the use of solitary by passing legislation and making changes administratively. Advocates are calling the deal an appalling act of cowardice. Cuomo also announced a plan to devote 500 cops to arrests for fare beating. Black and brown people are disproportionately targeted for arrests for subway fare beating. And on Wednesday, June 26th, there will be public hearings in the Con Edison utility rate case. Con Ed is proposing to raise electricity rates by 6% and gas by 11%, and wants to spend over $200 million ratepayer dollars to expand frack gas pipelines and LNG. DSA's Public Power NYC campaign is opposing the rate hike and fighting to decarbonize, decommodify, and democratize our energy system. The hearings will be at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. at the New York Department of Public Service, 90 Church Street on the 4th floor. And now back to Jack and Desiree.
Unfortunately, Desiree could not join us today, but we'll be hearing from her later tonight live from Caban's, hopefully the celebration for her campaign. Our daily headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC DSA Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. Subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And again, thank you, Lee Zishi, for an excellent reading of the headlines and all the amazing eco-socialist organizing work that you do. So before we dive into our interview with Julia Salazar, and you already probably heard a little bit about this on the headlines that we just read. Caban's election is today for Queens DA, and it's a very, very critical election. Queens, if it was its own city, would be one of the 5 biggest cities in the country. It's one of the most diverse places in the world, and its population, particularly black and brown people, have been under attack by vicious state violence for decades. People have been thrown behind bars for doing things that really almost everyone does. The idea that people should be locked in a cage at all, I think, is horrific, but particularly when it comes to like smoking weed or, jumping a turnstile because you need to get to work or to school. So this fight is really about, fighting back against mass incarceration, against the carceral state, against a regime of punishment against working class people, and about putting a working class queer Latina in the district attorney office to really transform it into a place of working class power. Now, there are real questions about the DA's office, but I think that's something that we can really elaborate on later tonight, and about the struggles that will occur after the election. Right now, it's critical that if you have the chance, get out and canvass, reach out to some DSA people, see if you want to go talk to them about getting involved in the last hours of the campaign, or at least please vote. Go vote for Caban. It's a really critical election. We have some recorded sound directly from Tiffany Caban, and we're going to share that with you right now.
If you have money, if you know how to game the system, you can do whatever you want in this city. If you're a person of color, you're poor, you're an immigrant, no one's on your side. My family is from Puerto Rico, and my parents worked hard to make ends meet. But no matter how hard they worked, the system cared more about protecting the wealthy. I'm a queer Latina from a working class family. People like us are exactly who the system is trying to keep down. That's why I became a public defender, to defend my community. I've defended over 1,000 clients who couldn't afford to defend themselves, who were thrown on Rikers because they didn't have money for bail, they jumped a turnstile, they struggled with mental health or substance use disorder. I'm running for District Attorney of Queens to bring justice to working people, to stop criminalizing poverty, to reduce recidivism, to decriminalize sex work, to end cash bail. But the corrupt Queens political machine doesn't want me to win because they get rich off of foreclosures. They've taken millions from developers, and I can't be bought and controlled. That's why they're going all in to elect Melinda Katz, because she will keep the status quo, take money from real estate, and protect the machine. Because she's a career politician who hasn't spent a single day in criminal court.
That's not true.
Yeah, it's true.
When we talk about the progressive prosecutor, these are the things that public defenders have fought for in court on the front lines every day and up in Albany for decades.
If you don't know, you're about to know. Tiffany Caban is going to be our next.
Here's the simple choice. Your next DA could be a career politician or a career prosecutor, or your next DA could be a public defender. Who do you trust?
Are you gonna win?
Yeah, we are.
It's great to hear directly from Tiffany. I thought that was a really amazing video that got put together by her excellent team that's been, really organizing on the ground, someone who came out of nowhere. People didn't know Tiffany Caban was just months ago, and now she's out there, really a national figure on the front lines of this movement to try and change, the horrendous aspects of our criminal justice system. It's not really a justice system. And the Queens machine, backed by real estate, backed by big capital, backed by the cops, standing in her way. And we're right now we're joined by Michael, who is Julia Salazar's communications director. And he's taken on the New York machine before in many electoral campaigns. And while we're waiting for Julia, who, as many New Yorkers have experienced before, is stuck in traffic, we'd like to hear your thoughts about like what it really takes and why it's so important to take on the political machine here in New York.
Yeah. So. Taking on a political machine is important because this particular machine, the way it operates, serves to enrich people who are politically connected and also creates impunity for people who are those connected people in a way. So one of the main ways that they will do this is through the surrogates court, which is a little known court that is also being elected today, the surrogate court judges. And what a surrogates court does is when someone dies or there's a dispute over their property, the state basically has to decide what to do with it. And so the people who end up deciding that are judges appointed by the county party. And so it turns out that large amounts of money are sort of being distributed through this means, which creates a financial incentive to price people out of their homes or to create these property disputes in the first place. So in terms of tactics, right, and beating a machine with a movement, which is what we were able to do with AOC, and what, I dearly hope we'll be able to do with Caban. I know for sure that a lot of the folks I know on the ground there are really strong field organizers, really strong general organizers. The difference between the sorts of tactics that we like to use here in New York and what the machine tries to do is we really focus on talking to voters. Seems really simple, but it's really not that simple. It's something that large parts of the political establishment here will send mailers. They will support sort of other organizations to help them by canvassing or by turning people out to wave on the street or to do whatever. But what really sets us apart as a movement is that we have this army of volunteer canvassers who feel strongly about the issues that we fight for. And we also, at this point, have a cadre of electoral organizers who really understand the nuts and bolts of campaigning. Skills that a consultant would charge, $10,000 or $15,000 to do poorly. We have people who are willing to do for free or for, a normal kind of internal campaign staffer's salary. And so, what this has been like is just watching in real time as a group of, a small group of motivated people, because we're big, but we're small, right? Like there's 4,000 or 5,000 members?
I think it's 5,500 plus if the numbers that I have are accurate.
Well, already then we're growing, baby. Yeah. But, and this is in a city of 8 million people, and then a metro area of like way more than that.
Yeah, I think it's like 20.
Yeah, like we are definitely a small group of motivated people, and that's the, as that quote says, I don't know who says it, but that's the only thing that's ever changed the world, and that's the only thing that will change the world.
But like what you're really saying here is like this people versus money is more than just a slogan. It reflects like the material reality of the campaigns on the ground. Like, for example, in the Caban campaign, DSA and coalition partners, because it's, there's the 5,500 NYC DSA members, but there's also all of these coalition partners and their organizers that are also working alongside us. Really pushing for this campaign by connecting with people on the ground, by, knocking on doors, by making phone calls, by like petitioning to even get Caban on the ballot in the first place. Well, you have supporters of candidates like Melinda Katz, where it's like last night, out of nowhere, she just receives like $28,000 from real estate.
Yep.
Where it's like, it's very clear the interests that she's serving. She's serving capital.
Well, and, one of the most shocking developments in the race was Rory Lankman, the candidate who was saying that he was, quote unquote, the other progressive in the race besides Tiffany Caban. When it became clear that her campaign was taking fire, he left the race and said, I want all my supporters to support Melinda Katz. And a good number of the community supporters that he had gained up to that point, were like, heck no, we're gonna stick with Caban because she's obviously the right choice. And honestly, Melinda Katz is unqualified. Yes, she's run a big office before. She's been a boss before, but she's never been in criminal court. It's really wild, the folks that the establishment puts up and sort of desperately needs to win in order to keep its stranglehold on power. And you can see that. There was the letter from real estate saying, our employees shouldn't vote for Tiffany, right? Because they're afraid if she gets in there that it's not just going to be working class people that are afraid of the DA's office. It's also white collar criminals. It's also, some of the folks who have traditionally wielded power in our society.
And we are now joined by State Senator and DSA member Julia Salazar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Well, happy to have you here. We have had a pre-recorded interview with you before, but we're very happy to have you live in the studio.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. Thank you.
We could talk about the traffic that you're just stuck in, and I'm sorry for that, but we'll move on to the bigger questions. Why did you get involved in the struggle against capitalism and the struggle for socialism, and why did you join DSA specifically?
It was back probably in 2014 or so that I had been involved in, at the time, throughout college, various local labor struggles, showing solidarity, a little bit of other involvement in the labor movement as an organizer, and I think that I just wanted to be able to organize with other people who were like-minded. It was actually, I think, out of my own material interests, I guess, that I eventually started reading Jacobin. I heard about Jacobin reading groups locally, and it was through attending Jacobin reading groups and some involvement in the community, actually through Debbie Medina's campaign for state senate 2 years before I ran for the same seat. She ran openly as a Democratic Socialist, that I heard about DSA and started going to meetings probably not until 2016, but began, I guess, getting involved in socialist organizing locally in Brooklyn before that.
It's always amazing to hear the commonalities between how people got involved in DSA, but also the particular stories that draw people in, whether it was a reading group or it was a campaign or it was Bernie or it was Black Lives Matter. There's so many different ways that really turn people against capitalism, recognize it as the enemy, and realize the need to get involved in organizing and struggling for socialism.
Yeah.
So why did you decide to run for state senator?
I actually was partly inspired by Debbie Medina, the candidate who ran for the same seat 2 years prior and the 2 years prior before that. But it was in the summer of 2016. I volunteered, supported her campaign. She is a Latina lifelong tenant organizer from the south side of Williamsburg who challenged Senator DeLon. And as a volunteer in her campaign, I was really inspired by her. I actually never considered running for office myself until early last year when some fellow DSA members came to me. We had organized together around some electoral work we had done. We had done the El Yatim campaign together, for example. And it was early last year that they came to me and said, someone needs to run against Delon. And I said, yeah, someone needs to run against Delon. And then they said, you're the candidate. And initially I was totally resistant, but over the course of only a couple of months, because there wasn't a lot of time to commit and decide, they persuaded me to run. It was particularly with our eyes set on the rent laws expiring this year. We knew that if we didn't elect an advocate for tenants' rights, and if we didn't replace a state senator who had made clear his allegiance to the real estate lobby, that we would be stuck with weak tenant protections all over again. And so that's what pushed me to run, and it really was hitting the ground running from there because the race was in September.
Well, I think many others in DSA are very happy that your comrades motivated you to get out there and run, especially considering this past legislative session and all the victories that we had as a movement. But before we dive into that specifically, what's it been like being the lone socialist elected official in Albany?
It's been a wild ride, but honestly, I was really impressed by how productive this legislative session was. I feel incredibly humbled and fortunate to have come in at precisely this moment when the political dynamic changed, so that with the Democrats in the majority, I was actually able to pass a significant amount of legislation and assist in passing the strongest tenant protections and rent laws that we've seen in a long time. I try not to, I guess, wear the socialist label as a scarlet letter. I'm unapologetically socialist, and everyone knows that. But what I find actually is that there are a lot of more people in Albany than there ever, at least in my lifetime, than there ever have been, who are willing to, they're at least sympathetic to democratic socialism and recognize that even for folks who don't explicitly identify as a democratic socialist, that we share a common worldview in many ways. So I've really enjoyed working with a lot of other legislators, especially fellow new legislators.
Well, this is a safe space to be an unapologetic socialist, so don't worry about it here. And that reminds me of an interview that I read that you did last week, where you made one of, if not the dopest statement I've heard from an elected official in my lifetime, where you said, quote, "I'm not bothered by the accusation that I'm a socialist or a communist. I'm a Marxist, and I'm not ashamed of that." How does Marxism influence your strategy as a representative of working class people in a capitalist state?
I think that the clearest way that it influences my strategy, and I guess the way that I operate as an elected, is that I know that the key to actually to bring about transformative change is to empower the working class. And it means that what we actually need to do is ensure that we break down the systems that have made it hard for working people to have access to the electoral process and to the legislative process. Means, for me, practically speaking, it means fighting for public campaign financing, right? So that more people can participate in every way in our elections. It means, in the case of the rent laws, fighting to empower tenants and working people rather than just developers and the real estate lobby. And you can look at every single area of policy and see how historically and currently the deck is stacked against working people. And so we need to be doing everything we can through policy to reverse that and empower the working class, so that we'll be fighting for not only a socialist society, but a more equitable society.
So it's like really about using your leverage as a representative of the people in the state to give them more resources and like the potential to build their own like working class institutions where they can exert that power like more fully and unleash their creative potential.
Absolutely. And I think the key to not only being a socialist, but particularly a democratic socialist, is this emphasis on everyone's collective responsibility in this, that everybody in, nobody out. We want to bring as many people into the movement as possible, with minimal gatekeeping, so that we'll have more power together.
That sounds great to me. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter to get links to what we talk about on the show. You can do that on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com. You can also find us on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today, we're talking to State Senator and DSA member Julia Salazar. So we've been talking about, kind of the theory and the practice that you have in Albany, but we've been talking about that more on a broad scale, like ideologically, I would say. But now, we want to talk about the specific material gains that have been made over the past few months in Albany. And I think the biggest issue that people have been focused on has been housing. So can you explain the package of rent regulation bills that was passed last week?
Yeah, so this year, as in the past, every 4 years, typically, the rent laws that govern rent regulation that protect tenants, mostly in New York City, but throughout the state, were up for renewal. They were slated to expire on June 15th. And I've never seen the housing justice movement as strong as it has been in the last year, in anticipating the expiration of the rent laws and building to fight for the strongest rent regulations that we could. The Housing Justice for All Coalition, I know that this has been discussed on the show a lot previously, but the coalition was fighting to pass these 9 bills, one of which I was the lead sponsor of, the Good Cause Eviction Bill. But in addition to that, bills that particularly impact rent-regulated tenants, seeking to close the loopholes that property owners have been able to use to bring units out of rent regulation. Thousands of units of apartments have been removed from rent regulation over the years in New York City, and that's just a profound loss of affordable housing, and of course leads to displacement and all sorts of problems in our communities. And so this was an opportunity for us to really close those loopholes, but instead of just playing defense and closing those loopholes, we wanted to expand rent regulation, empower tenants across the state, their communities, to opt in to existing rent regulation, and then also give protections to tenants who have never had any. We, in the Senate and the Assembly, we hosted public hearings about the rent laws over the last few months across the state. In the past, it's been sort of this issue that was framed as dividing the city and communities outside of New York City, tenants' rights is just a city issue, and that they don't need rent regulation upstate. But what we found through those hearings and the testimony of ultimately hundreds of tenants across the state is that they are desperate for intervention, for the laws to change in order to empower them to stand up and for their rights as tenants and be able to stay in their homes. And so ultimately, we passed a really strong rent regulation package. It wasn't, as usual, 100% of what I wanted, but it's still absolutely transformative. It's going to keep a lot of people in their homes, and most importantly, we made the rent laws permanent. There's no sunset date in this legislative package, and so we're not in the position as organizers and advocates of having to be up against the wall 4 years from now, and the opposition is not able to just refuse to talk about housing justice and tenants' rights until we're down to the wire with the rent laws expiring. So that's one of the biggest victories of passing this package, is not only that we have these stronger tenant protections for regulated and non-regulated tenants, but we also are in a better position to demand more, and we should be demanding more.
Yeah, rather than having to be constantly on the defensive against real estate capital, now the tenant movement has the ability to continue to push forward and build more power. And you touched on how you've never seen the housing justice movement seems this powerful before, and be able to really build these institutions that can last. So how critical were these independent tenant unions and working class institutions of grassroots power in defeating real estate capital, and how do we keep fighting back against those forces?
These grassroots movements were the most critical component of this victory. If it weren't for many of these advocates, these tenant associations, this coalition, first and foremost, it demonstrates the relationship between electoral activism and legislative advocacy, other grassroots organizing campaigns, because a lot of these advocates had fought not only to elect me, but other new progressives in the state Senate who ultimately were really strong advocates for tenants' rights. But beyond that, they didn't stop there. The unity of the housing justice movement no longer concentrated in New York City, but across the state. That's what made it so powerful. And compelled legislators who previously have been able to say, this isn't an issue my constituents care about. They heard from the tenants in Rochester, in Buffalo, in Binghamton, in Kingston, and of course in New York City and in Long Island. And that was the most powerful thing. And I think it was what allowed us to secure additional eviction protections, not the full good cause eviction bill, but additional eviction protections and those for tenants outside of the regulated system, because the voices were from not the same or tenants who had self-organized in the past in rent-stabilized buildings, and it just made an enormous difference ultimately in getting us over the edge and empowering us to win as much as we did.
The movement is really spreading, not just in terms of belief, but actual working class institutions are now statewide, and they're working together, which is just really beautiful to see. However, as you mentioned before, it's really important to recognize that we didn't win everything in this fight. The housing justice movement didn't achieve all its goals. And you were briefly talking about the just cause eviction bill, but why is this so important? Why did it fail to pass? And what must be done to ensure it becomes law in the future?
Right. So many units or apartments that were previously rent regulated have been lost, and for tenants across the state, they have virtually no protections whatsoever from an unconscionable rent increase or from eviction for almost any other reason at all. Tenants often, what we heard from tenants across the state is that even in places where, unlike New York City, rents are typically not rising at an unsustainable rate like they are in my district and in the city, even in places where their rent is relatively stable, they have a fear of reporting poor conditions in their building. They have a fear of organizing their building, certainly. A fear of complaining to their landlord because they know that their landlord will threaten to retaliate or just refuse to renew their lease, even if they've been a perfect tenant, even if they've paid on time, that there are no protections for an unjust eviction. And some would say, and frankly, I would agree, because I believe that housing is a human right, that nobody should be evicted. But within our legal context, the strongest proposal that we could have. It was and still is the good cause eviction bill, which I'll continue to fight for, despite that it didn't pass in this package. I'll continue to carry the bill and fight for it. We actually were able to gather an enormous amount of support, more than on the other bills that did pass, which is sort of telling about the legislative process in a way, and how things ultimately get done, especially when they're as contentious as the rent laws. But yeah, what the good cause bill does is it would limit rent increases, tying it to something called the CPI, which is really just inflation, the rate of inflation. And say, if a landlord tries to raise the rent above this threshold of your current rent, then then in court there's a presumption that was too high of an increase and the tenant shouldn't have to pay it, and they have to charge you a more reasonable rent closer to what you pay now, and as long as the tenant exercises their rights, which is in itself difficult to do. A tenant would be able to say, you need to show good cause to evict me. And the reason that threshold is really important is because often a landlord would, instead of properly moving to evict a tenant, they would just say, you can renew your lease, but this is the rent increase, and it's so high that the tenant can't afford to pay it, and so it's a de facto eviction, essentially. Something that I've experienced when and naturally it was shortly after I had organized my building years ago. So those are the essential provisions of the bill, and most importantly, it would apply to tenants outside of regulated housing, and with only some exceptions, and the exceptions just exist to protect small homeowners and people who live in their buildings, or owners who live in their buildings, rather, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it seems like kind of like not the final step, but like the next step in what we were discussing before about really giving tenants like the ability to like not be on the defensive, so that they can actually build power without being the threat of being thrown out of their home. And so they don't have, like, if you get thrown out of your home, what are you going to do with your life? It's really a violent act. And I think it's really crucial that we continue to fight for this bill so that like tenants can actually build power in this city and fight back against the people that are draining half of their income every month. So you are listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter to get links to what we talk about on the show. You can do that on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com. And you can also find us on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today, we are talking with Julia Salazar about the end of the legislative session in Albany and the future struggles and legislation that we hope to pass in the year to come. So one landmark legislation that I was really happy about was the commemoration of the Mets' 1969 World Series.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a fantastic resolution.
I'm hoping that I get to see one of those victories at some point in my lifetime.
Yeah. I won't hold my breath either, but I hope so.
But I guess to get more serious for a second, we talked in depth on our last week's episode about the CCPA. But I'm sure our listeners would be fascinated to hear a Democratic Socialist state senator's perspective on the legislation. Like, why was it such an important bill? What changed at the last minute? And why does Cuomo always make things worse?
Yeah, it's very important to Governor Cuomo to be able to insert himself into the legislative process and try to control the legislative process. What was actually remarkable about the rent laws victory was that it was primarily negotiated between the two houses, and when it comes to the CCPA, ultimately we'll pass the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's really landmark climate justice legislation. Thankfully, the changes were minimal. I would say to the final bill, it was really important to legislators for us to learn from the mistakes in strategy of the past and to try to really negotiate the legislation between the two houses. But what's so important about it, some have called it a Green New Deal for New York State. I'm hesitant to use that label because I think it is ambitious state climate legislation, but the purpose of this, I'll just continue to call it the CCPA because that's what's most familiar to people, despite the last minute change, which was from Governor Cuomo, naturally. But
he doesn't deserve for us to call it that. We'll just keep the original name.
We'll just keep calling it the CCPA. What's so important about it, I think, is the emphasis on climate justice, on environmental justice, and social justice on equity. So how we know that the effects of climate change have been so much more severe for communities of color, for working class communities, and we also know that any transition it's a crisis. It's virtually an existential crisis that we're facing with climate change, and in order to actually combat it and reverse some of the effects of it, we need a complete transition to 100% renewable energy. And what the CCPA seeks to do is say, by 2050, 100%, and we have until then some benchmarks to meet. As far as transferring fully to 100% renewable energy, and in that process, with keeping in mind that climate change is disproportionately harmed at-risk communities, the communities I represent. We need to ensure that it's a just transition. So people who are currently employed by no real fault of their own, but employed by the fossil fuel industry, working class people, also by any of the other industry that kind of upholds the use of fossil fuels, that those people are trained in green jobs, similar work, so they can continue to do the work that they've done throughout their lives and not lose their jobs, while also supporting a just transition and rejecting the continued use of fossil fuels. And so I'm proud, it is entirely thanks to, I believe, the organizations in the New York Renews Coalition, including NYC-DSA's Eco-Socialists, including many of the organizations that were involved in other policy victories this session, that if it weren't for them, we would have come out with something that's much more compromised. And it's only the beginning. We have to we have to fight to make sure that the benchmarks are actually made, or met, rather, the goals are met in the process of transitioning to 100% renewable energy, that the bodies that were created to oversee the transition, that the appointees on those boards are from the communities that are most impacted, and that they're people who deeply care about this and care about the community's interests rather than private interests like the fossil fuel industry.
You've been talking a lot about the marginalized communities that have been particularly brutally affected by capitalism and by state violence. And there's two pieces of legislation, one that passed and one that didn't, that I want to dive into. But first, I just want you to briefly describe the Reproductive Health Act and why it was so important.
I think that if we look across the country right now, we can see that women's right, not just women's rights, but the rights of any pregnant person to bodily autonomy are under attack in other states, in Ohio, in Georgia, in Alabama, really all over, and by the federal government as well. There's a terrifying threat to potentially overturn Roe v. Wade. And so it was really important that in the very first week of this legislative session, we passed Senator Kruger's Reproductive Health Act to not only codify the provisions of Roe v. Wade for any pregnant New Yorker, and ensure access to a safe and legal abortion, but also ensure that people who are in the later stage of their pregnancy, if the pregnancy is a clear, direct threat to their life, and if the pregnancy is simply clearly deemed by a physician to not be viable, that even in those circumstances, someone would be able to get an abortion, because it's just completely unreasonable and poor medical practice, frankly, to deny an abortion when it's really necessary. And frankly, even when it's, as long as it can safely be performed, when it's not absolutely necessary, someone who is pregnant needs to be able to have that choice.
Yeah, the way that the reactionary state governments and the federal government right now are attacking women's health rights and ability to have bodily autonomy is just a vicious way of disciplining working class people, because that's who's going to get hurt by this sort of legislation. Very rich people always escape the law no matter what. And another way that both state governments, but particularly the federal government, is viciously attacking working class people right now is by targeting immigrants in general, but particularly undocumented immigrants. And so last week, the Green Light Bill was passed. And how does this directly impact the lives of undocumented people and protect them against the state terror of mass deportation?
Green light legislation extends the right to get a driver's license to every New Yorker, regardless of immigration status. This actually used to be the law in New York not too long ago. It was in the few years just after 9/11 that, due to anti-immigrant sentiments, a lot of rights that actually immigrants had in the U.S. and in New York State were curtailed, and it's been a long fight to try to restore those rights. It's absolutely essential particularly for our undocumented neighbors who need who work and especially outside of the city. We're fortunate to have, despite the problems with the MTA, we're fortunate to have still a pretty reliable and robust public transit system in the city, but a lot of workers, farm workers in particular, who thankfully also had their rights extended this session, farm workers, undocumented workers across the state, it's really important for them. It's important for parents, for families, and frankly, it's important that we recognize that people are going to drive if they need to drive, and our roads are safer if we ensure that everyone, regardless of immigration status. It's absurd that would ever be a barrier to someone being able to get a driver's license, but everyone who's driving be able to safely get a license, and be trained in the rules of the road. But for me, the most compelling reason to pass the legislation is just to make sure that everyone who in other ways is dealing in their daily lives with anti-immigrant sentiments and racial discrimination and bigotry, that we can take this step to give them dignity. Everyone deserves to be able to move through our own neighborhoods with confidence, and thankfully, I think that's what we were able to do.
And really humanize people, and rather than creating them as some other to be scared of. These are just human beings that are working, trying to survive, doing what everyday people do. And it's really horrifying the way that they are demonized, but it's really encouraging to see legislation like this passed. There's a lot of legislation that hasn't been passed that I want to talk about. I don't know if we're going to be able to fit it all in the last few minutes, but I also want to open the phone line to see if we can get maybe a couple calls as we wrap up. It's 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877. So there were a few acts that were being discussed around both like ICE out of courts, sex decriminalization, and marijuana legalization that haven't passed yet, but were really critical. Is there any one of these in particular that you would like to discuss?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about any of them, but I'm the lead sponsor of a bill to fully decriminalize sex work in the Senate. So I'm happy to discuss that more if you like.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, because we just covered this in a recent episode where we had some incredible sex worker organizers from Decrim NY come here and talk about like how absurd it is that they are like demonized in our society and that they are like really thrown into the underground economy and exposed to more violence that way. It's like, why is the decriminalization of sex work such an important struggle for socialists, and what is the status of the legislation?
So we just introduced the legislation, the full decriminalization bill, at the end of the session, about a week before session ended, myself and Assemblyman Gottfried. So it, it hasn't moved through committee or anything yet. We expect that to happen next session and in January, potentially sooner if we return to Albany before then. But it's so important as socialists, as progressives, and people who care about the working class and marginalized in our society, because a lot of the majority of sex workers are women and women of color. Certainly in New York City, a disproportionate number of them are trans, and in the way that the so-called prostitution-related offenses and charges in state law are enforced is deeply discriminatory against our trans neighbors and against women of color. And so that's something that we should be deeply concerned about. We know that 94% of the people who are arrested for a charge referred to as loitering for the purpose of prostitution, which is just a deeply discriminatory law, 94% of those people are Black women. And so the way that this is enforced, it's really hurting the communities that I represent. In East New York, part of my district, and Bushwick, we've seen an alarmingly high number of people being charged with this. And it's so important also we want to decriminalize sex work because we want to be able to empower people. Rather, we know that criminalization is not going to resolve the problems that lead to people through circumstance or coercion to end up in the sex industry. And we know that we need to shift to instead toward a restorative justice model in general, but furthermore, to just not criminalizing sex work, that it is work, and that all workers deserve rights and to be able to do their work safely, and decriminalization is the path to that.
Yes, sex workers are human beings who deserve a life free of state violence. And we have a caller on the line. We have a time for a very brief comment or question. You're live on Revolutions Per Minute. What's your comment or question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Great show. I love your show. I love all these shows on WBAI. I wish they do more shows like this than music, but that's another topic. I have to say, when you said it's absurd to have a person who has come in unlawfully to have a driver's license, that person needs to speak English. Our roads are very crowded. A driver's license is a privilege. It could be taken away if you're DWI or dangerous person. And to say it's absurd is a little bit above the word absurd, because there is a legal process. People that came in through Ellis Island had to go through a legal process. We didn't just allow everybody to come in. They have to be checked for any diseases. They might have communicable diseases. Do they speak English? Can they support themselves? There's a lot of things. I mean, I know there's a big outrage about putting kids in cages, but that is not the fault of the government. That is endangering the welfare of a child to try to bring them in. I know everybody wants to have a better life, but we got 7 billion people on the planet. Half of those people would love to have a better life. I would love to have a better life by going to somebody's Hamptons home and mansion and making myself, but that's private property and that's trespassing. School taxes are paid. People that come into the country get free school taxes.
Hey, we're running low on time, so we've heard enough. I would like to give the state senator a moment to respond, but first, when you say that it's not the government's responsibility, I would do a little research into the dirty wars in the 1980s and what our country has done to Central America and what these people are fleeing from before you make very ignorant comments. But I'd like the state senator to reply. Absolutely,
yeah. A lot was said, so there's a lot to unpack, but I'll stick to the driver's license portion of the caller's question. They mentioned actually DWI is a means of revoking a license if somebody is driving irresponsibly, and I think that's pretty critical. Even if, as it seems, you're less concerned about immigrants' rights, most people are concerned about our roads being safe. And if somebody isn't able to get a driver's license, then we can't determine whether or not they legally, should be able to drive. That we can't be adequately protecting pedestrians, anyone else on the road. And there are other mechanisms to make sure that anyone, certainly regardless of immigration status, is driving who shouldn't be driving or who's a danger to other people. But there isn't a case here. There's really no case, and that this is what makes it absurd. There's no substantial reason to deny someone based on their immigration status alone, or at all, the ability to drive.
Yeah, the idea that it makes someone dangerous is ridiculous. We have to wrap up now, but I just briefly want you to mention the important election going on today, and if you want to encourage people to go do something.
Absolutely. So I represent the 18th district, which is entirely in Brooklyn, but there is a very exciting race today for Queens District Attorney. We have a candidate, Tiffany Caban, who is a queer Latina, fierce public defender, endorsed by DSA. I was very proud to endorse her, and she has tremendous grassroots progressive support. Has really run a campaign with integrity and is a very promising candidate for district attorney. She would really be fighting to decarcerate and bring restorative justice to our communities. So I really hope everybody gets out and votes. The polls close at 9 p.m. tonight.
Well, thank you so much for that great endorsement, and thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. There's so much more I would like to talk about. We also will be covering the Caban election results live here on WBAI with Revolutions Per Minute at 9 p.m. Please join us then, and thank you for joining us for this episode.